Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin wrapped up a call yesterday speaking about a ceasefire deal that Trump hopes to get done. And really what I want to point out here is that a ceasefire has already been attempted in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, and it failed. As Zelensky very clearly pointed out in his Oval Office battle, his 2v1 battle that he went through against Trump and Vance face to face. And really, a ceasefire at this point in time is something that would almost most certainly benefit Russia. And it's not something that's an end-all be-all to where, okay, we get a ceasefire and that immediately results in less death and more peace because there's not currently conflicts happening between Russia and Ukraine if we were to have a ceasefire. But really what it opens up is down the line for Russia to just go ahead and do what they did in 2022 all over again, right? So let's look at this here where it says, this is from Reuters. It says, Trump says we are very much on track after Zelensky call. Russia and Ukraine accused each other on Wednesday of violating a new agreement to refrain from attacks on energy targets hours after it was agreed by Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. But a prisoner swap touted as a confidence-building step went ahead, and Trump followed Tuesday's phone call with Putin with the call on Wednesday with Zelensky, saying afterwards that we are very much on track. Trump said his very good phone call with Zelensky lasted an hour. Their first conversation since an Oval Office meeting descended into a shouting match on February 28th. The discussion followed Tuesday's call with Putin and aimed to align both Russia and Ukraine in terms of their requests and needs. During Putin's call with Trump on Tuesday, the Russian leader rejected a proposed full 30-day ceasefire, which had been sought by Trump and previously accepted by Ukraine, but Putin agreed to pause attacks on energy infrastructure, a proposal that Zelensky accepted. The narrowly defined pause appeared in doubt on Wednesday, however, with Moscow saying Ukraine hit an oil depot in southern Russia, while Kyiv said Russia had struck hospitals and homes and knocked out power to some of its railways. Still, the two sides announced they had carried out an exchange of prisoners, each releasing 175 troops in a deal facilitated by the United Arab Emirates. Moscow said it also freed an additional 22 wounded Ukrainians as a goodwill gesture. Zelensky said on Wednesday that the continued attack showed Moscow's words did not match his actions and that Russia was not ready for peace. He said the United States should be put in charge of monitoring any ceasefire. So we tried this with the Minsk agreements. We tried this back in 2014 and then in 2015 with the Minsk II agreements that really were way too favorable to Russia and allowed Putin's greater invasion of Ukraine in 2022 because of how favorable the Minsk agreements were to him. So let's look here. Zelensky points this out in this White House meeting. I have the transcript of it here. So JD Vance says, can I ask you something? So you occupied big parts of Ukraine, parts of East and Crimea. So you occupied it in 2013. So during a lot of years, I'm not speaking about just Biden, but in those times there were President Obama and then President Trump and then President Biden and now President Trump. This is Zelensky speaking to Vance. And God bless President Trump will stop him. But during 2013, nobody stopped him. He just occupied and took and he killed people. 2015, Trump interrupts. Vance, 2014 to 2015. Trump, I was not here. Zelensky, but during 2014 till 2022, the situation was the same, that people been dying on the contact line. Nobody stopped him. You know that we had conversations with him, a lot of conversations, my bilateral conversation, and we signed with him. Me, like a new president in 2019, I signed with him. The deal I signed with him, Macron and Merkel. We signed ceasefire. All of them told me that he will never go. We signed with him gas contract, but after that, he broke the ceasefire. He killed our people, and he didn't exchange prisoners. We signed the exchange of prisoners, but he didn't do it. What kind of diplomacy, JD, are you talking about? What do you mean? Putin's not someone to be negotiated with, right? It's good that this prisoner swap did occur, okay, that was agreed to recently, and it did occur. Okay, great. But when it comes to an agreement that is going to stop this conflict once and for all and send Russia back from whence they came and guarantee a sovereign, independent Ukrainian government that is allowed to exist without the threat of Vladimir Putin deciding that he is going to swallow up a smaller independent nation with a much smaller military, this agreement needs to be very, very, very strong and not favor Russia whatsoever. Because what happened, and I'll pull up the Minsk agreements here for you, is that the agreements were far too favorable to Russia. Minsk 1 signed in September 2014. It included provisions for a ceasefire in eastern Ukraine, withdrawal of heavy weapons from the front lines, exchange of prisoners, granting special status to certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions, and allowing humanitarian aid and OSCE monitoring. Failure, the ceasefire quickly collapsed as fighting resumed. Okay, so this leads us to the Minsk 2 agreement signed in February 2015, which outlined an immediate ceasefire and withdrawal of heavy weapons, dialogue on local elections in separatist-controlled areas, continual reform in Ukraine to grant autonomy to Donetsk and Luhansk, restoration of Ukrainian control over its border with Russia, and amnesty for separatists. So now what we'll look at here is a little bit of an analysis of the Minsk agreements, why they ultimately failed. This is from the Institute for the Study of War, where Natalia Bugavoya writes on February 11th, 2015, some peace deals lead to peace, others to more war. The Minsk II deal aimed to end Russia's limited invasion of Ukraine in 2015, but instead laid the groundwork for the full-scale Russian invasion in 2022. The United States must learn from the Minsk deal or risk a direct Russia-NATO conflict that puts American lives at risk. Minsk II was a weak deal. It demanded nothing of the invader, Russia. It strengthened the Kremlin's aggressive worldview that had driven the conflict to begin with. It masked Russia's military weakness. It gave the Kremlin time and space to prepare for a larger invasion. The West could have helped Ukraine reach a stronger deal in 2015. Minsk II gave Russian President Vladimir Putin hope that he could win in Ukraine without war. Russia sought and failed to control Ukraine in 2014 by military means. Minsk II gave Putin a way to demand that Ukraine, an independent state, give Russia control over its internal policies. Putin failed at that too and turned to the full-scale invasion in 2022. So here's a little bit of why some of the main flaws in the Minsk II agreement is that it absolved the invader. The deal let Russia pose as a mediator in a conflict that it started and prolonged. Ukraine was conflict-free until 2014, and then Russia invaded. Russia falsely framed its war as internal to Ukraine. The DNR and the LNR were not independent, however. The Kremlin not only controlled and resourced the DNR and the LNR, it kept them alive. Both would have ceased to exist without Russian support. Putin had to deploy regular Russian forces to Ukraine in 2014 to prevent the DNR and then LNR from losing to Ukrainian forces. So basically what happened is that this propaganda that there's some sort of internal battle in Ukraine of people who deeply, deeply want to be a part of Russia and don't want the Ukrainian government to exist in these eastern parts of the Luhansk and Donetsk regions of the country. They were never actually real Ukrainian people who were actually Ukrainian and actually had some sort of bone to pick with the Ukrainian government. They were totally propped up by Russian money and Russian military forces that in fact kept the region alive. And they would have failed if it was not for the direct support of Russia to these regions. But then they went ahead and used those regional conflicts as a justification for their widespread invasion of Ukraine in 2022. But it was all propaganda, right? There was never actually there isn't a strong contingency of people in Ukraine that want Ukraine to be absorbed by Russia. Are there people out there that do buy into that thinking? Probably, right? But what Russia was attempting to kind of set up was that this was some widespread sentiment that even the Ukrainian citizens don't like the Ukrainian government. So we should be able to pummel them and make them submit to our will based on that idea that Ukrainian citizens don't want to be Ukrainian or have a Ukrainian government. But that's all propaganda, right? So, the Minsk agreements were never strong, and any ceasefire deal that is entered into now, America must be very, very wary of the terms that we allow the ceasefire to be entered into, because if it's anything like the Minsk agreements that allows Russian talking points to dictate certain elements of the ceasefire, Russian talking points that are nothing but propaganda and are not verifiable truths and verifiable aspects to the conflict. If Russia is allowed to do that, we very well could wind up in a situation where a ceasefire is entered and many people in the country and even in Europe celebrate, yay, no more conflict, right? Yay, okay, we can put this one to bed, right? But then let's say 10 years from now, Russia's aggressive worldview that has been emboldened by the United States, first in the Minsk 1 deal and then the Minsk 2 deal, and later on by this hypothetical ceasefire, if it were to be entered between Donald Trump and Putin, we very well just might end up in a situation where Russia decides to hold off on attacking Ukraine for a certain period of time, and then lo and behold, they attack Ukraine again, or God forbid, they attack a country involved in NATO, which would trigger an Article 5 response that's only ever happened one time when we got attacked by Al-Qaeda. That would certainly be a situation that would perhaps spark a larger regional war that the United States is involved in, with boots on the ground, or assisting with providing of no-fly zones. And that's not something we want at all. So this isn't a situation where a ceasefire is the end-all be-all, and a ceasefire is something that must be sought after to stop the bloodshed at at any cost, because we saw what the ceasefire did in the past and how it led to the eventual continued destruction and pillaging of Ukraine as a country. So you can't blame the Ukrainians for being pretty wary of any negotiation that's brokered by Donald Trump and Putin at this point in time. And this is where, you know, sometimes strength and sometimes standing up to a bully the first time around is, you know, meeting strength with strength is what ultimately leads to long-lasting peace. And, you know, peace just for the sake of peace and for the sake of saving some Ukrainian and Russian lives in the short term doesn't necessarily lead to a long-term resolution to the conflict, and in fact could make the conflict even worse in the long run. So really, we need to be very, very careful about the terms that we're agreeing to, and the American people in general need to be aware that Donald Trump seeking a ceasefire doesn't necessarily mean that Donald Trump is seeking a long-term resolution to the Ukrainian-Russian conflict.